One of the manuscripts that was actually produced, and I think this again goes into what Evan was discussing. Here's a manuscript map over here, and this was the one that was done by Dorr, so this has Missionary Ridge primarily on it, and obviously you can't see it, but essentially what he did is this is the actual manuscript, and you can see he does put in the contours. The final document, however, although many of the officers went to, or some of the officers went to U.S. military academy, many of them were political appointees. In the Civil War, if you were with a volunteer army, it could have been the most popular guy in your neighborhood wound up being the captain of your particular company. And of course, all you had to do is show maybe a modicum of intelligence, and the next thing you know, you were a colonel and you had a regiment. Well, many of these had no idea on how to read contours and how to read maps. So essentially what had to happen is we had to dummy them down. So here's a finished map that was actually produced by the Coast Survey post-war to kind of give you an idea. And instead, you no longer see, and this is a compilation of both the Dorr and Don manuscripts, and basically it's cleaned up, and through shading and hashers, we can look at this and we can pretty much interpolate or get an idea, a good visual image of what was the landform out there. So this would be, many of these maps, even though it'll say 1863, in many cases were produced, as you said, post-war. Lookout Mountain, obviously the mapping did its job. Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. And the thing I like about this, and what made their job maybe a little bit more hazardous but a little bit easier, first of all, based on what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be on the wrong side of the river trying to map this afternoon. Number two, they're just a sketch. Obviously, I'm pretty certain that the artist was probably there. There ain't a whole lot of buildings in the way to do any triangulation. And of course, this is why I tried to get to the U.S. Coast Survey to find out. I wanted to get the field books because I really wanted to find out where the baselines are at. None of them, they're probably, if you go to the Library of Congress under Memories, any map during the Civil War, you can go in. I'd say probably Chattanooga has probably one of the most complete sets of maps of anything. I mean, unbelievable number of maps. I probably downloaded at least 20 different maps by different topographers, including Sneeden, that are out there. So these are just some ideas from them, some representation. But anyhow, I believe that they would probably be on the other side of the river, and again, in relatively wide open. They used a scale of 1 to 10,000, again, metric, and then they basically did the conversions into however many inches to the mile. I know this person here probably is one of the most popular people down here. Mr. Personality. The thing of it is, Sherman, many of the maps that we up to this point in time were primarily tactical in nature. Sherman, on the other hand, used a more strategic view. Okay. He knew from the 1860s, Sherman just didn't plain move out of Atlanta and decide, okay, on a whim one day, hey, I think I'll march to the sea. He had the 1860 census tract data for the state of Georgia to calculate how much food his army would need on the march. He had successfully observed that Grant had cut himself off at Vicksburg and literally lived off the land. And essentially what happened was he knew to the ton what the country could produce, and also he had spent quite a bit of his earlier years in the South, and he knew that it could sustain his army. So this was not one of those whimsical things of saying, hey, let's give it a shot and see what happens. He knew what he was doing. Sherman Also, the other person that we talked about earlier was Poe a long time ago. To kind of give you an idea what happened to him, we mentioned that he was at Rich Mountain. He was a lieutenant. His star rose along with McClellan's. He went to the Peninsula Campaign. Poe decided, hey, being a lieutenant or a captain isn't good enough. He became a colonel of a volunteer regiment. Sooner or later, he wound up being a colonel of a brigade. And then, of course, he was nominated to become a brigadier general. His nomination was never acted upon. He had resigned his commission as a colonel in that volunteer organization out of Michigan to get his generalship, and then all of a sudden, the Congress said, yeah, we got enough generals. In one stroke, he went from a colonel, almost a general, back to a lieutenant in the regular, and also it just happened that he wound up being, just at the same time, the Corps of Topographical Engineers were absorbed in the Corps of Engineers. So he got on his high horse and said, wait a minute, I should be a captain, you know, here, if you start counting from the top and the bottom, this is where I should be. So he wound up with Burnside at Knoxville as a captain. Ultimately, he got together with Sherman, and essentially he ultimately, as the chief of engineers of the Division of the Mississippi under Sherman, again rose to the rank of brigadier general. We've mentioned about all the post-war work that he had done with the lighthouses and around the Great Lakes. He met his end rather through just a really freak accident where he was inspecting the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, slipped, got a fairly decent scratch on his leg, and ultimately died of blood poisoning. Okay. Civil War saw the greatest increase of mapping of the interior, somewhere between 1861, about 20,000 up to about 80,000 maps. This is one of Poe's maps at Knoxville. I will not discuss the other anachronism or little thing that happened. I'm not going to discuss it a lot. It's in the PowerPoint, but it's not in the paper. Is the fact that the Corps of Topographical Engineers were assigned the Blue Corps under Thaddeus Lowe, literally built military balloons. Most of the conservative generals saw it as nothing more than a circus act. McClellan embraced it, and they were used at the Peninsula Campaign and several others. What was most interesting, you probably know this guy. Graduated at the bottom of his class, but because he was a good artist, they gave him to the topographical engineers and put him in a balloon. As a cavalryman, I had the choice as to the character of the mount, but the proposed ride was far more elevated than I'd ever desired or contemplated. The interstices, or gaps in the wickerwork, and the sides and bottoms seemed immense, and the further we receded from the earth, the larger they seemed to become, as I imagined, one might stumble through. So the man who was afraid of no Indian and no Confederate was deathly afraid of heights. He did finally, and I still have yet to, I did see one copy of one of the sketches he made. It was in a book. I have not been able to find the original through Library of Congress, but apparently he was a very good artist.
What's his
He
name?
and Sitting Bull had a little fracas out a Little Bighorn. Kind of a hair-raising event, I heard. Yeah, George Custer. The George Washington Parke Custis was arguably the first world's aircraft carrier. Anyhow. Wrapping up, during the Civil War, the Topographical Bureau and the Corps of Topographical Engineers were abolished by an act of March 3rd, 1863, with the functions being turned over to the Office of Chief Engineer and Corps of Engineers. Balloon Corps were transferred to the Signal Corps and disbanded thereafter. At war's end, Grant orders the topographers back into the field to map the Civil War battlefields. So the Army of the Potomac got to go down Pennsylvania, have their march down down Pennsylvania Avenue. Sherman's Army, next day, they got to go down Pennsylvania Avenue. The topographical engineers, along with contracting with Confederate topographers, were sent out into the battlefields and were to map the battlefields for future posterity.